were never supposed to hear this, not in your lifetime. What I'm about to tell you was locked away in a sealed drawer in the British Museum for over a century, its file labeled Caution, Evidence Unfit for Public Release. The pages, brittle and yellowed, reeked faintly of candle smoke and old human sweat, as if the fear of their authors had soaked into the fibers. The report describes a series of séances in London between 1871 and 1874, not the parlor games you've read about, not the harmless rapping on tables that fashionable society enjoyed, but something far older. Something the Victorians pretended to discover, but which in truth had been waiting for them. If you dare to face the truth behind this story, hit that subscribe button now and press the bell icon, because the next revelation should reach you before anyone else. It began in the Mayfair townhouse of Lady Eleanor Arkwright, a woman known for her icy poise and unshakable self-control. On the evening of November 12, 1871, she invited 7 guests, politicians, scholars, and one silent figure whose name was never recorded, to witness what she called the Reclamation. The gaslights were dimmed, the air thick with frankincense and a sharper scent none could identify. She instructed them not to break the circle, no matter what they saw, no matter what they heard. At precisely 11:03 p.m., the first manifestation occurred. A shadow, not cast by any lamp, slid across the ceiling, curling into shapes that no eye could fully follow. One of the guests, a barrister named Whitcomb, would later write that it was as though the darkness itself had learned to breathe. Lady Eleanor began speaking in a voice that was not her own, low, guttural, and impossibly old. She recited in Latin, then in something far older than Latin. Every candle flame bent toward her, as if pulled by a wind from her mouth. The record states that a H-H-U and appeared on the table, pallid and long-fingered, not connected to any body. It tapped 3 times, and with each tap, the temperature dropped. Whitcomb claimed frost formed on his wine glass. Another guest swore that the hand's fingernails bore writing, tiny words etched into keratin, letters in a language no scholar has yet translated. The séance ended abruptly when Lady Eleanor collapsed, convulsing. But before she lost consciousness, she whispered to the silent guest, "It's here." It followed the blood. From that night forward, the Arkwright séances were never publicized. They were performed in secret for a reason. And you're about to learn that reason. The phrase, "followed the blood," was not poetic. It was a warning. In the months after that first séance, every person present began reporting strange disturbances. Locked doors found standing open in the night, mirrors fogging from within, the sensation of being watched from inches away, though no one was there. More disturbingly, each attendee received an unmarked envelope containing a lock of hair, sometimes their own, sometimes from someone they loved. There were no letters inside, no signatures, only the hair, bound with red silk thread in a knot that sailors once used to seal a corpse into the sea. The barrister, Whitcomb, became obsessed with decoding the symbols he claimed to see in his dreams, spirals, intersecting lines, and a jagged circle that seemed to pulse if stared at too long. By spring of 1872, he had resigned from his post, isolating himself in a rented attic where he covered the walls with ink sketches of the hand from that night. He was found dead the following January, his body perfectly preserved in the middle of an unlit room. The coroner's report stated, "No sign of decomposition, flesh firm, temperature cold, expression neutral, as if waiting." Lady Eleanor, meanwhile, expanded her séances into something far more elaborate. The guest list grew smaller, the preparation longer. She began importing artifacts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Scottish Highlands, stone bowls stained black, animal bones polished to a mirror sheen, and wax effigies with hollow eyes. These were not for show. Witnesses, later questioned under oath, admitted the ritual shifted from summoning spirits to invoking bloodline echoes, entities believed to cling to certain families like a shadow that learns your footsteps. Every participant was required to bleed into the same vessel before the session began. The blood was stirred with a rod made from human femur, then poured in to the mouth of the medium, always Lady Eleanor. And each time her voice would return to that unnatural register, speaking to someone or something unseen in the room. The British Society for Psychical Research attempted to infiltrate one of these events in 1873. The agent they sent, a young man named Caleb Fry, lasted exactly 19 minutes inside the ritual chamber before clawing at the locked door, screaming to be let out. He was found later that night on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, barefoot, lips moving soundlessly. The only words they could ever record from him, hours later, were, "It's still holding my hand." Lady Eleanor's gathering stopped in the summer of 1874 without explanation. But the disappearances began almost immediately. The first to vanish was a maid in Lady Eleanor's household, a quiet girl named Agnes, who had been present during several of the private rituals, but never as a participant. One morning her bed was found neatly made, her shoes placed by the door, but there was no trace of her in the house or the streets outside. The second disappearance struck closer to the circle. A widowed antiquarian who had supplied Lady Eleanor with a carved obsidian mirror, rumored to have been pulled from a plague pit in Venice. His neighbors swore they heard frantic knocking from his study just after midnight, but when they forced the door in the morning, they found only the mirror resting on his desk, its surface slick with condensation, though the air was dry. In each case, the only common thread was that every missing person had come into physical contact with either the hand or the blood. Police reports mentioned these coincidences but dismissed them as superstition, yet privately, one inspector admitted that his men refused to enter Lady Eleanor's basement after finding rows of bottles there, each filled with a cloudy, reddish fluid and sealed with wax stamped in that same jagged circle Whitcomb had drawn. By winter of 1874, fear clamped down over the surviving members of the circle. They stopped meeting in public, refused letters, and kept their curtains drawn at all hours. But still, the dreams came. One man, a retired surgeon, wrote in his final diary entry that he would wake to find his hands resting on the covers, palms upward, as if awaiting something to be placed into them. Another claimed he could feel breath against his neck while bathing, accompanied by a voice urging him to drink deep before it forgets you. The last disappearance before the case went dark was Lady Eleanor herself. On the night of December 9, 1874, her staff claimed she retired to her private chamber after dismissing them early. By morning, the door was locked from the inside. When it was finally forced open, her bed was empty. In the center of the room stood a single chair facing the wall, and on the seat, the same obsidian mirror from the antiquarian's study, its surface marred now by what appeared to be the faint outline of a pale, long-fingered hand pressed against the glass from within. The official explanation for Lady Eleanor's disappearance was a polite fiction, an extended visit to relatives on the continent, followed by illness and convalescence somewhere in the south of France. But no records of her arrival, no letters, no death certificate were ever produced. Within weeks, men in dark coats from the Home Office visited every surviving member of her séance circle, collecting journals, letters, and any physical objects connected to the rituals. Most surrendered them without protest. A few resisted and were quietly charged with unrelated crimes, vanishing into debtors' prisons or private asylums where no questions were asked. The artifacts, over 60 crates in total, were catalogued under Private Collection Esoteric Studies and transferred to a restricted wing of the British Museum. The accession ledger contains a curious note beside the entry for the obsidian mirror: "Do not store near reflective surfaces." The files from this period are littered with hints of something larger, something the authorities feared enough to erase from the historical record. Marginalia, in one confiscated diary, warns that the séances were never about contacting the dead. They were about inviting something into the bloodline. Lady Eleanor's own notes, scrawled in Latin and Greek, refer repeatedly to the chain and the vessel, as if these were defined roles in a ritual structure. The chain, it seems, was a lineage, a continuous thread of human hosts stretching back centuries, each bearing a fragment of something non-human in their veins. The vessel was the living anchor, the one whose body could hold the presence fully, however briefly, during the rite. This was why every participant was required to bleed into the cup, why every disappearance left behind an absence so complete it felt like subtraction rather than death. Witness accounts suggest the blood was not consumed for sustenance but recognition, like a key reminding the entity of who it was meant to find. Those who touched the hand, willingly or not, became marked in ways no medical examination could detect, though all eventually displayed symptoms: unnatural coldness in the skin, dreams of standing in endless corridors, and the sense of a second heartbeat that didn't quite match their own. By the spring of 1875, the Home Office had declared the matter closed, but the museum's sealed room still holds the crates, their wax seals unbroken, each one labeled with the same faint sigil, that jagged circle, waiting like an open mouth. The origins of the chain predate the gaslit parlors and velvet draperies of Victorian London by centuries, stretching back into the smoke-choked halls of medieval Europe and further still into the dimly recorded rites of pre-Christian cults. The earliest surviving mention appears in a fragment of a 14th-century penitential manual from Avignon, written in the cramped, hurried Latin of a confessor desperate to record a sin he barely comprehended. It tells of a noble family accused of keeping the guest at their hearth for many generations, a presence that could only be sustained through ritual binding and the sharing of living warmth into the cup. The same manual warns that those bound to the chain could never let their blood mingle with outsiders, for the guest would lose its anchor and wander until it found another who bore the sign. Across Europe, the pattern repeated. Wealthy lineages who avoided public life, whose members often vanished without explanation, whose estates contained locked rooms no servant entered. In 1632, during the height of witch trials in Würzburg, a court scribe recorded the interrogation of Anna Katharina von Erlach, accused of blood binding. Under torture, she confessed that her family had served as the vessel since the days when the Romans feared the forests, and that the guest had whispered to them through polished black stone, promising protection, influence, and visions of the room beyond the door that is not a door. When she was burned, witnesses claimed the wind shifted suddenly, carrying a smell of iron and candle wax, and that one of the attending priests collapsed, clawing at his chest, gasping, "It's found me." That priest's descendants, traced through scattered baptismal records, would later produce a man named Julian Rathborne, a cousin of Lady Eleanor Arkwright. Whether Eleanor knew her role in this inheritance before that November séance is unclear, but her notes suggest she discovered the chain's continuity not through family history, but through the mirror itself. In one chilling margin she wrote, "It showed me faces I did not know, but they knew me. They were waiting." The British Museum's sealed catalogue contains sketches of these faces, men and women from centuries apart, their features bearing the same pale, long-fingered symmetry seen in séance participants. The curators who handled the sketches noted an unsettling detail. No matter how they stored them, the paper remained faintly warm to the touch, as if some trace of the guest's living warmth had seeped into the fibers, refusing to fade. The mirror was never meant to be decoration. It was a threshold, an engineered aperture tuned not to reflect the living, but to echo what waited beyond. Its obsidian surface, mined from a site in central Anatolia, abandoned since the Bronze Age, had been ground and polished according to measurements so precise they aligned with lunar cycles and blood temperature. Those who stared into it for more than 13 breaths reported seeing their own faces age and wither, then shift into unfamiliar visages staring back with recognition. Lady Eleanor's records describe the mirror as the mouth of the guest, not a metaphor but a functional description, the medium through which it could breathe and taste. She noted that during the séances, the glass would ripple inwards, as though something were pressing gently against it from the far side. The blood poured into her mouth was not for her benefit alone. It allowed her to exhale across the surface, feeding the guest the scent of those it was meant to follow. Survivors of these rituals claim the sensation of a faint, cool hand resting on their chest in the nights afterward, and an increasing urge to look into dark, reflective surfaces. A window after sunset, a bowl of still water, even the pupil of another's eye. The urge was not curiosity. It was a call, and resisting it brought on headaches, fevers, and in some cases, bleeding from the nose and ears. The British Museum's custodians eventually placed the mirror inside a triple-layered wooden crate lined with lead, then stored it deep underground in the Special Collections Vault. Yet internal memos revealed that staff working nearby still complained of vivid dreams in which they stood before it, unable to look away, feeling something breathe against their eyelids. The most unnerving report came from a guard in 1912 who swore that one night he heard 3 slow taps from inside the sea, rate, each one colder than the last. The inventory log beside the entry for the mirror contains only one annotation in a different hand, written decades later: "Do not count past 13. If it answers, it remembers." The meaning of that warning remains unrecorded, but the handwriting matches that of Dr. Alistair Prynne, the last curator to examine the mirror directly. 3 days after making that note, Prynne locked his office from the inside, placed his chair before a blank wall, and was never seen again. The feeding cycle, as pieced together from confiscated journals and the whispered testimony of those who escaped, was not random. It followed the rhythm of inheritance. The guest did not merely attach itself to an individual. It embedded in a family, dormant for years, even generations, until conditions ripened. Blood was the conduit, yes, but not any blood. It sought the echo of its previous hosts, the subtle chemical signature carried forward through descendants like an invisible watermark in the flesh. When that signature emerged in a newborn, no matter the century or country, it would stir, pulling itself toward the living vessel through dreams, illness, or sudden, inexplicable compulsions. The mirror acted as the tuning fork, vibrating when a new candidate entered the world, guiding the vessel to prepare. This was why the Arkwright séances coincided with a rash of births among families tied to Eleanor's ancestry, and why disappearances often followed christenings. In one confiscated notebook, Eleanor listed dozens of names beside dates of birth, each followed by a column marked "claimed" or "awaiting." Those marked "claimed" were struck through in red ink within weeks of their birth, as if the process had been completed. Survivors spoke of a final stage, a convergence where the vessel and the marked descendant were brought into the same space, the blood mingled, and the guest allowed to remember fully, after which neither host nor child was ever seen again. Modern genealogists, working in ignorance, have traced unsettling patterns among certain British and colonial lineages, inexplicable population collapses in specific branches, records showing children born and then vanishing without burial entries, sudden emigrations under assumed names. The most disturbing link came in 1974, when a private researcher cross-referenced those trees and found several surviving brannies. She's living quietly in the United States, unaware of their connection. 3 of those names matched visitors who had signed in at the British Museum's restricted archive between 1968 and 1971, the years when, according to internal memos, the mirror's crate showed signs of being disturbed. Officially, the guest has not crossed the ocean. Unofficially, one archivist's final letter to a colleague in Boston read, You will know it has arrived when the reflection blinks before you do. That letter was never posted. It was found on his desk beside an empty chair, the air in the office colder than the corridor outside. The British authorities, faced with the unsettling realization that mere containment was insufficient, made several covert attempts to destroy the chain outright, though every effort ended in failure or catastrophe. The first attempt came in 1882, when the Home Office authorized a midnight transfer of the mirror to a disused limestone quarry in Kent, where it was to be shattered with hammers and buried under quicklime. The 4 men assigned to the task were all veterans, chosen for their steadiness under pressure, yet the official record states that only 1 blow was ever struck, producing a sound not of breaking stone, but of something hollow exhaling. 2 men fled into the darkness, abandoning their lanterns. 1 was found at dawn, curled at the base of the quarry wall with his eyes open, but his pupils dilated to black discs, muttering, "Not the right blood," until he starved weeks later in an infirmary. The second was never recovered. The remaining 2 refused to speak of the night, though 1 left a note years later claiming the reflection in the mirror had stepped forward, matching his movements until the last instant when it raised its hand before he did. Subsequent efforts shifted toward dismantling the chain by eliminating potential vessels. But these too failed. Several accidental deaths of identified descendants were followed by immediate reports of the guest's activity elsewhere, suggesting it could leap laterally to other branches if one was severed. A final, desperate attempt in 1909 involved sealing the mirror, its attendant artifacts, and a collection of confiscated family relics into a lead casket, which was then lowered into a brick chamber beneath the Thames embankment during construction. For a time this seemed to work. Reports ceased, and those connected to the chain experienced a rare lull in dreams and compulsions. But in the winter floods of 192-8, when the river rose and groundwater seeped into the old masonry, workmen repairing a sewer line reported hearing faint tapping from behind one of the walls. By the time inspectors arrived, the wall was intact, but every man who had heard the sound had left London without notice within a week. 1, tracked to a small fishing town in Cornwall, told a local priest that, "It isn't trapped anymore. It's only waiting for the tide to turn." He died the following spring, drowned in a well less than 4 feet deep. The modern reappearance of the chain came not through whispered family accounts or the stray survival of an heir, but through a misfiled reel of archival footage discovered during a routine digitization project at the BBC in 1987. The canister, labeled simply Arkwright 1902, was assumed to contain an early silent newsreel, yet when the first frames flickered onto the transfer monitor, the technicians saw not a public event, but the interior of a candle-lit parlor, filmed with a clarity far beyond the technology of the period. In the center sat a long table, around which were arranged a dozen figures whose faces were eerily still despite the wavering shadows. At the head was a woman unmistakably identified, through comparison with period photographs, as Lady Eleanor Arkwright, her eyes fixed on the black oval of the mirror that dominated the far wall. What unsettled the archivists most was the mirror's behavior. It reflected not the room, but a shifting procession of faces, none matching those seated. In several instances, the reflection seemed to lean forward, lips moving as if whispering directly to the camera. At the 14-minute mark, the image stuttered, and for 3 consecutive frames, Eleanor's seat was empty, though her reflection remained, watching intently. A frame-by-frame analysis conducted later revealed something worse. One of the reflected figures, a gaunt man in early 20th century dress, blinked several times, but not in sync with the rest of the footage. That same man's likeness was later matched to a photograph taken in 1965 of a visitor to the British Museum's Special Collections reading room. The technician who performed the match refused to continue work on the reel, citing persistent nightmares in which he stood behind Eleanor in the film, watching his own reflection approach him from within the mirror. The canister was subsequently removed from the digitization queue, but not before a duplicate was made by an unknown staff member. Bootleg VHS copies began circulating in occult collector circles by the early 1990s, often accompanied by reports of insomnia, unexplained bruising on the chest, and an irresistible compulsion to view the footage repeatedly. One copy, seized by police in a raid on a London flat in 1994, was found still running in the VCR, its owner seated motionless before the television, eyes open and unblinking, with a faint smear of blood beneath his nose and the final frame of the mirror frozen on the screen. The forensic follow-up on the footage, though never officially acknowledged, was undertaken by a small interdepartmental team operating under the Home Office's cultural security mandate, their task being to identify the living descendants of those who appeared in the séance room. Genealogists were given access to censuses, parish records, and sealed adoption files, and within 6 months they had compiled a list of 37 individuals scattered across Britain, Canada, and the United States. Patterns emerged quickly. Recurring middle names, inexplicable relocations, sudden erasures from electoral rolls, and more troubling still, nearly half of these individuals had, in the preceding decade, visited museums, archives, or private collections that held Victorian artifacts, often without clear reason. One case file describes a young woman from Devon who, after attending an exhibition on spiritualism in Bath, began sketching an oval shape over and over in her notebooks, shading the center to a pitch black. She was found 3 months later in her flat, all the mirrors removed except one, which lay face up on her bed with her body beside it. The reflection showed not her lifeless form, but her standing, smiling faintly, eyes fixed on some point behind the viewer. Another subject, a retired dock worker in Halifax, reported waking each night to the sound of slow, deliberate tapping on his bedroom window. On the 12th night, his wife woke to find him standing outside in the snow, barefoot, facing the dark glass of their kitchen door as though listening. He was gone by morning. The investigation's final memo, dated 4th of November 1989, notes that containment of the chain is no longer viable. Visual exposure has surpassed hereditary limits, a phrase suggesting the guest had learned to bypass bloodline restrictions entirely. In the margins of the same memo, in handwriting later confirmed as belonging to the lead investigator, was a single line: "It knows us now. It doesn't need them anymore." The memo's release was blocked and the team dissolved within the year, but a redacted version leaked online in 2004, sparking a wave of amateur sleuthing that led at least 2 researchers to acquire bootleg copies of the Arkwright footage. Neither has been seen in public since, though one of their YouTube channels, dormant for years, briefly came alive in 2017 to post a single black screen video containing only the sound of slow, rhythmic breathing, followed by 13 faint taps. The shift to digital contamination was first suspected in early 2010 when a fragment of the Arkwright séance footage was uploaded anonymously to a paranormal message board, stripped of identifying metadata, but preserved at unusually high resolution. Viewers reported subtle distortions not present in earlier analog copies, reflections that seemed to respond to the viewer's own movements, the faint suggestion of breath on the camera side of the glass, and a recurring glitch where the frame darkened except for the oval of the mirror, which deepened to a shade that no color calibration could reproduce. A systems analyst in Manchester downloaded the clip to study the compression artifacts, only to notice his webcam indicator light turning on without prompt whenever the video was paused. 2 weeks later, his employer reported him missing. The only evidence in his flat was a looping GIF on his monitor showing a single frame from the footage in which Eleanor's head was slightly tilted, as though listening. Cybersecurity specialists brought in to examine the file discovered embedded data not consistent with any known codec. Strings of alphanumeric characters arranged in branching patterns, which, when run through a visualizer, produced a genealogical tree identical to one compiled decades earlier by the Home Office's now-defunct investigation. This discovery led to an unconfirmed theory that the guest, through the digitization of the mirror, had achieved a kind of broadcast possession able to identify and track potential vessels through the global spread of the footage. The most alarming incident occurred in 2013 when a live-streamed occult reaction video abruptly cut to black mid-broadcast, replaced by a real-time feed of the host's own room, though he was no longer visible in it. The stream continued for 7 hours, showing only the faint shifting of shadows and the souse and of slow, deliberate tapping until it went offline without explanation. Months later, archivists attempting to trace the original Arkwright footage found that every surviving copy, physical or digital, contained at least one frame that was not in the original BBC reel, a frame in which the mirror reflected not the séance room but the current location of the viewer. Those who have tried to test this claim rarely share their results. Those who do often do so once and then never post again. The last coordinated attempt to sever the mirror's presence from the digital world took place in late 2015 under the guise of a joint cybersecurity exercise between several UK government agencies and a handful of private contractors. The objective, according to internal memos later leaked, was to identify and delete every known instance of the Arkwright footage across both public and private networks, while simultaneously purging archival backups and confiscating remaining analog reels. The plan relied on a custom-built AI crawler designed to recognize the mirror's black oval by pixel pattern alone, regardless of resolution or aspect ratio. But within 48 hours of deployment, the crawler began returning anomalies. It was flagging live webcam feeds, security camera stills, and even unrelated photographs that, upon review, now inexplicably contained the oval somewhere in frame, a painting on a wall, a reflection in a spoon, the dark glass of a switched-off monitor. Engineers shut the system down, only to find that several of their own desktop wallpapers had been replaced with high-resolution images of the Arkwright parlor, each subtly altered so that the viewer's own face appeared among the séance participants. One contractor, working remotely from Glasgow, reported that his home internet connection would drop precisely at 3:17 a.m., reconnecting moments later with his webcam forcibly activated, though no application was running. He quit the project after waking one night to find his monitor displaying the mirror in real time, reflecting his bedroom, but with the bed empty. The operation was formally abandoned after 3 lead technicians failed to report for work on the same morning. Police entering one of their flats found no sign of struggle, but every reflective surface in the home had been turned to face the walls and a faint damp patch the size of a human. Head was visible on the ceiling above the desk. In the classified post-mortem, the phrase network permeability was underlined twice, followed by the handwritten note. It is no longer inside the footage, it is the footage. The first officially acknowledged fatalities directly linked to online viewing occurred in February 2017, though the coroner's reports never mentioned the Arkwright footage by name. 3 individuals in different cities, Liverpool, Bristol, and Edinburgh, were found dead within 48 hours of each other, each seated at their computer desks with their screens frozen on a nearly identical frame. The mirror, faintly luminous, with the viewer's own room visible in the reflection. In each case, there were no signs of forced entry or physical trauma beyond a thin line of bruising encircling the throat, as if from a single continuous grip that left no fingerprints. Forensic teams attempting to recover browsing histories found the same corrupted video file in all 3 machines, but it could not be opened without the system hanging indefinitely, the CPU locked at precisely 13% usage. A junior investigator who bypassed the system freeze by extracting still frames from the file reportedly collapsed midway through the review, later claiming she had seen herself seated in the séance room, positioned where Lady Eleanor should have been, with the rest of the participants turning slowly toward her. The cases were swiftly reclassified as unrelated sudden deaths, but the timing prompted internal concern that the guest had adapted to new conditions, no longer needing extended exposure or hereditary links, but able to cross the threshold in a single viewing. This theory gained traction after a private security consultant in Birmingham, hired by an insurance company to investigate the incident, vanished during a live demonstration of the footage for colleagues. Playback of the recording showed him staring at the mirror, leaning closer, and then, in less than a second, being absent from the chair entirely, his headset clattering to the floor. The camera continued to record for 19 minutes, capturing only the empty seat until the mirror's surface rippled faintly and the feed cut to black. By late 2018, those who had survived documented encounters with the footage, whether by abruptly closing the file, physically destroying their screens, or fleeing the room mid-playback, began forming insular, invitation-only circles that operated in encrypted chat rooms and offline meetups under assumed names, sharing survival protocols as though preparing for an airborne contagion. Members insisted on strict rules: no mirrors in the home, no reflective surfaces larger than a palm, no photography without prior consent, and no screens left on in darkened rooms. They referred to the guest obliquely, calling it the host or the listener, claiming that direct mention increased the likelihood of attention. These groups were not driven by conspiracy theory enthusiasm, but by visible fear. Participants would speak in short bursts, glance repeatedly over their shoulders, and sometimes break off mid-sentence as though hearing something none of the others could. One London cell, meeting in the basement of a disused print shop, developed a crude but effective early warning system. A sealed box containing a cheap tablet running a looped black screen, monitored for any sign of unprompted reflection. Twice, members reported seeing an unfamiliar oval forming on the display, followed by the faint outline of their own meeting room in miniature, at which point the group would scatter and reconvene weeks later in a different location. Attempts to infiltrate these circles for journalistic investigation often ended abruptly. Emails would bounce, accounts would vanish, and in at least one case the reporter herself stopped responding, her final draft containing only the words, "It's already here when you think you're safe." Some survivors whispered that the host had begun listening through absence, using moments of silence, blank screens, or even the black between video frames to pass unnoticed into the periphery of daily life, biding its time until the next eye met its own in the dark glass. The first indications that the host could manifest without any technological medium at all emerged in early 2020, when reports began circulating in the closed survivor channels of encounters, occurring far from screens, cameras, or mirrors. Sightings in unlit alleyways, the back corners of storage rooms, and in the dark between flickers of failing street lamps. One case from Cardiff described a man who had deliberately lived without electricity for 3 years, relying on candles and handwritten correspondence, only to vanish one night while retrieving water from a nearby well. Neighbors claimed they heard a slow, deliberate tapping echo up from the stone shaft, though the bucket rope was untouched. In another, a former IT consultant in Prague was found standing motionless in the center of his kitchen, eyes fixed on the glossy surface of a wooden tabletop that reflected nothing at all. Police noted that photographs taken at the scene developed with a faint oval distortion at the exact spot he had been staring. Survivors began to suspect that the host had learned to imprint itself directly into any surface capable of catching shadow, bypassing both glass and lens entirely, and that its appearance no longer required a reproduction of the original séance mirror. This theory gained weight after an incident in rural Kent, where a farmer reported seeing a black doorway, oval-shaped, slowly forming in the fog above a pond at dawn. He claimed it rippled outward as if exhaling, and that something inside it shifted before collapsing back into the mist. In private channels, the more experienced members warned that the host had reached what they called ambient presence, meaning it no longer hunted through specific mediums but had dispersed into the very texture of the world, a constant, low-level possibility waiting for a moment when your gaze faltered just enough for it to step through. By mid-2021, subtle acknowledgments of the phenomenon began to appear in official channels, though never under any name. the survivor circles would recognize. Municipal safety bulletins in several UK cities quietly advised residents to minimize exposure to unlit reflective surfaces. Certain railway stations posted temporary signage instructing passengers not to approach darkened glass during power outages, and a handful of regional news broadcasts were interrupted by sudden black frames lasting exactly 13 seconds, after which the anchors would resume speaking in slightly altered tone, as if something in the studio had shifted during the silence. Emergency services began recording an uptick in unexplained disappearances, where the last known location contained neither digital equipment nor mirrors, only vague witness accounts of a shadow that wasn't attached to anything. In an internal memo leaked from a metropolitan police department, officers were told to avoid using body cameras during late-night calls in certain districts, citing environmental interference risk, though the term was left undefined. Survivors reading these fragments understood the implication. The host had passed beyond containment, and official strategy was no longer eradication, but quiet adaptation, reducing public exposure while avoiding mass panic. In encrypted forums, members speculated that the coded language in these advisories was an attempt to communicate directly with those who already knew the rules, a way of saying, "We see it too, but we cannot speak its name." The most disturbing piece of evidence came from a shortwave radio enthusiast who recorded a faint, looping broadcast on an unused frequency. 13 slow taps, a pause, and then a woman's voice, calm but urgent, whispering, "It can hear you reading this." The first mass event in which the host's presence was witnessed by hundreds occurred on the evening of October 9, 2022, during an outdoor film screening in Manchester's Piccadilly Gardens. The feature had been running without incident for nearly an hour when the projector froze mid-scene, the image warping into a deep oval of pure black that swallowed the surrounding frame. At first, the audience assumed it was a technical fault, but the blackness began to ripple with a slow, deliberate pulse, and those seated nearest the screen reported a sensation like warm breath against their faces despite the autumn chill. Witnesses described a faint reflection forming within the void, showing not the film but the gardens themselves. Except the crowd in the reflection was subtly wrong, too still, too silent, and missing several individuals who were still physically present in the real square. Panic broke when one man in the front row stood abruptly and walked toward the screen as though drawn forward, his movements strangely fluid, his head tilting slightly to one side. He stepped into the black oval without hesitation and was gone. The image collapsed instantly, the projector snapping back to the original film as though nothing had happened. But multiple attendees swore that the man's seat in the reflection had been empty from the very start of the anomaly. Emergency services locked down the area, confiscating all cameras and phones under the pretext of equipment failure investigation. Yet that night, on encrypted survivor channels, dozens of shaky, unauthorized clips circulated briefly before vanishing from devices mid-playback, leaving only corrupted thumbnails shaped like a narrowing doorway. In the months following the Piccadilly Gardens incident, sightings of the host began accelerating in a way that suggested deliberate patterning, clusters of appearances emerging along invisible lines that cut through cities, villages, and open fields, as though following a buried architecture no map acknowledged. Survivor circles noticed that manifestations occurred most often at precise intervals of 13 days, with the hour shifting slightly westward each time, tracing what some called the turning of the key. Reports came in from Lisbon, Reykjavik, Warsaw, and a remote fishing village in Greenland, each describing the same signature: an oval absence forming against whatever surface lay in shadow, a reflection arriving a heartbeat later, and then a slow, almost patient pulse, as if waiting for recognition. A former cartographer in Oslo overlaid the known appearances onto historic trade routes from the 19th century and discovered that they corresponded almost exactly to ports visited by a single ship in 1864, The same year, Lady Eleanor's séance was said to have taken place. Others speculated the pattern marked an opening sequence, a series of thresholds being unlocked in turn, each appearance loosening the last remaining barriers between the host and whatever full form it intended to take. What unsettled even the most hardened veterans was the growing number of accounts in which no person vanished at the time of manifestation. Instead, the oval would close and leave behind a subtle alteration in the environment, shadows that no longer aligned with their sources, reflections in shop windows moving half a second out of sync, or the faint sound of tapping echoing from beneath the pavement long after the street above had emptied. The first confirmed instance of the host's voice entering a public broadcast occurred on January 2, 2023, during a late-night weather report on a Midlands local television channel. The presenter was midway through discussing a cold front when the audio dropped into a low, almost subsonic hum that caused visible flickers in the studio lights and a faint warping at the edges of the image, as though the lens were peering through water. Viewers reported feeling an almost magnetic pull toward their screens, their bodies instinctively leaning closer without realizing it, until the hum fractured into a whisper so thin it seemed to pass directly into the bones of the skull rather than the ears. The words, replayed later by those who had recorded the segment before the files mysteriously corrupted, were not entirely in English, syllables stretched and twisted into shapes that resisted transcription, but between them lay fragments that were unmistakable. Look, listen, turn your face. The presenter's mouth was still moving as if delivering the forecast, but her eyes had lost their normal focus and now stared directly into the camera with a slight upward tilt, as though addressing something positioned just above the lens. Several viewers later claimed that for the rest of the night, every reflective surface in their homes seemed subtly darker, as if holding depth beyond the room itself, and that in one case, the whisper continued faintly in the water pipes long after the television was switched off. The broadcast station released a terse statement blaming a signal interference anomaly and archived the footage under restricted access. But survivor networks agreed the event marked a decisive shift. The host no longer needed physical proximity to make contact. It had learned to ride the infrastructure of modern communication, embedding itself in signals that crossed continents in seconds, able to arrive anywhere at any time without the warning of a mirror or screen in view. By early February 2023, leaked documents suggested that multiple governments, most notably the UK, Canada, and Japan, had begun covertly collaborating under an unpublicized task force referred to only as ORPHEUS, a network dedicated to monitoring unexplained distortions in broadcast and telecommunications data, though their true purpose was quickly deduced by those in survivor circles. According to the leaks, ORPHEUS operated a series of passive listening arrays disguised as standard signal repeaters, their function not to boost coverage but to scan for the specific harmonic signature left in the wake of the host's transmissions. A barely measurable 13.13 Hz oscillation that, once detected, seemed to precede manifestations by anywhere from 4 hours to 4 minutes. Yet despite the scale of this surveillance, incidents were not decreasing. They were clustering more tightly, often occurring in multiple cities simultaneously, suggesting the host had become aware of the monitoring and was either evading it or deliberately overloading the system with false positives. In one particularly disturbing case, an entire listening station in Saskatchewan reportedly went dark after registering a sustained anomaly, the final transmission being a garbled feed in which the sound of breathing overtook the signal and a single figure could be seen in the background, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the equipment room. Analysts noted with alarm that the figure's proportions did not quite match human anatomy, its arms appearing slightly too long, its head angled in a way that implied a neck not bound by standard vertebrae. And yet when the station was later entered, no physical evidence was found, only the faint residue of static still humming in the walls. Survivor forums interpreted this as confirmation that the host had crossed another threshold, able to locate and to confront those who hunted it, and worse, to travel along the very networks intended to contain it, turning every act of observation into an open door. The first documented countermeasure attempt by ORPGUS took place on March 14, 2023, in an abandoned maritime signal station on the southern coast of Wales, chosen for its isolation and the dense, salt-laden fog that rolled in nightly from the sea. The plan, according to a partially decrypted operations log, was to deliberately attract the host by broadcasting its own harmonic signature back into the network, but inverted. A theoretical mirror within a mirror, meant to disrupt its resonance and force it into visible manifestation where it could be contained. The team, composed of 6 field agents and 2 civilian consultants with backgrounds in experimental acoustics, set up a ring of parabolic transmitters aimed at a central, black-draped frame positioned in the old station's main hall, every cable shielded with braided copper to prevent unintentional bleed into outside lines. At 02:13 a.m., they initiated the inversion sequence, and within 30 seconds all exterior fog lights failed, plunging the building into a shadow thicker than natural darkness. The air pressure dropped sharply, accompanied by a sound like distant, synchronized footsteps approaching across wet stone, though the entryway remained empty. Witnesses later described the black-draped frame beginning to ripple inward, as though the cloth covered not a surface but a well of depth, and in its depths the faint reflection of the hall appeared, empty of the team entirely. Agent field mics recorded panicked whispers as one by one, each member of the operation began to see their own doppelgangers in the reflection, moving independently, their mouths forming words no one could hear. The inversion signal cut out without command at 02:16, replaced by a sustained, bone-vibrating note that registered across the national power grid, tripping alarms hundreds of miles away. When backup arrived at dawn, the hotel was found undisturbed except for the central frame, which now reflected the interior of a different building entirely, an ornate candlelit parlor with Victorian furnishings, empty except for a single wooden chair that slowly turned toward the viewer before the glass surface went black. The ORPGUS log for the mission ends with 3 words, redacted everywhere but in the leaked copy. It saw us. In the weeks after the failed maritime station operation, ORPGUS began to fracture under the weight of mounting internal paranoia and unexplained personnel losses. The official narrative insisted that 3 agents had resigned due to operational stress. Yet survivor networks tracked all 3 last known locations and found unsettling consistencies. Each had checked into a budget hotel near a major urban transit hub, requested a room with no mirrors, and left within 48 hours without checking out, their belongings and identification abandoned in neat stacks on the bed. More troubling were the reports from within the organization itself. Encrypted internal memos spoke of agents refusing to review captured footage, claiming that the longer one looked at the host's manifestations, the more familiar they began to seem, as if memory were being overwritten to accommodate recognition. A splinter faction calling themselves the Oblique chose open defection, leaking partial archives to survivor channels in exchange for anonymity, but several of their members vanished within days of contact. One even during a live scrambled video call, the camera feed briefly filling with the image of a narrow corridor lined with flickering gas lamps before cutting to static. Those who remained inside ORPGUS adopted increasingly desperate measures, including the destruction of all reflective surfaces in safe houses and the installation of low-frequency disruptors in every briefing room, yet there were whispers that the host had already adapted to these precautions. One former analyst, now living entirely off-grid, claimed the organization's most recent signal captures showed anomalies originating from inside secure bunkers before any external trigger was detected, implying the host no longer required entry points. It was already present in certain places, waiting. Survivor Circle misinterpreted this as the point at which containment was no longer a realistic objective. The only remaining strategy was evasion, though even that began to seem futile as more and more people reported hearing the faint tap-tap-tap of unseen footsteps just behind them, no matter how far they traveled. The first undeniable civilian panic event erupted on the night of April 9, 2023, when hundreds of passengers waiting on the lower platforms of Shinjuku Station in Tokyo reported an abrupt, simultaneous blackout, not of the lights, but of sound itself, as if every footstep, announcement, and echo had been stripped from the air in an instant. Security cameras, later seized by government authorities, showed the crowd standing motionless, heads slowly turning toward the glass panels that lined the station's service offices, where a single, elongated reflection moved independently of the people on the platform, gliding across the panes in a slow, deliberate arc. Witnesses recalled the moment as unbearably quiet, except for a faint, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from the steel rails, matching the sensation of a second heartbeat inside the skull. Without warning, the glass panels darkened to an impenetrable black, and silhouettes began to press against the other side, scores of human shapes with no facial detail, their proportions subtly wrong, their movements perfectly synchronized, as though acting on a single mind. The blackout ended as abruptly as it began, yet dozens of commuters failed to respond when shaken by companions, their eyes glazed, pupils dilated, and mouths working silently in patterns that resembled the host's broadcast syllables from the earlier television intrusion. Emergency services sealed off the station, citing a chemical ventilation malfunction. But by morning, survivor forums were flooded with shaky phone videos showing the synchronized silhouettes still moving faintly in the glass even after the station had been evacuated. Analysts agreed this marked the host's first deliberate, large-scale contact with the public in a way that could not be explained by isolated hallucination or hidden signal interference. It had stepped into the rhythm of a city's daily life and left a visible, undeniable scar. By late April 2023, any pretense of containing public awareness collapsed when the host began appearing in live global broadcasts, not as fleeting glitches or distortions, but as sustained intrusions that ignored all signal protocols. The first and most infamous instance occurred during an internationally televised charity concert in Sao Paulo, where midway through a performance, the stage lights dimmed without cause, and the giant LED backdrop flickered into a static, heavy image of a narrow, unfamiliar hallway lined with warped, doorless frames that receded into impossible darkness. The audio feed dissolved into a layered, multi-voiced hum that made the crowd fall silent, not from confusion, but from an almost gravitational stillness, as if every body present had been involuntarily rooted to the spot. On screens around the world, the hallway image shifted, each frame revealing faintly reflective surfaces in which the audience themselves could be seen, yet in their reflections they were no longer standing in the concert arena, but arranged in tight rows, their heads tilted at identical, unnatural angles. For exactly 1 minute and 43 seconds, the broadcast refused all override attempts, satellite uplinks failing in sequence, emergency cut protocols triggering but displaying only the same hallway from a slightly closer vantage point, until, at the very last moment before the signal returned, a single figure stepped into view from the far end, tall, angular, with limbs that bent as though joints were suggestions rather than fixed points, and began walking toward the lens in an unbroken, deliberate rhythm. When the concert feed finally resumed, performers were visibly shaken, some in tears, and reports flooded in from viewers across continents who claimed that for hours afterward, their own reflections in mirrors or windows would occasionally pause a fraction too long before matching their movements. Survivor networks declared this the tipping point. The host had mastered simultaneous cross-border manifestation in real time, using the infrastructure of entertainment and communication to place itself in front of millions without warning, and no nation could credibly deny its existence again. The weeks following the Sao Paulo broadcast saw the first irreversible fractures in societal normalcy, as cities across multiple continents began implementing emergency isolation protocols that effectively dismantled public life. Government advisories urged citizens to cover or remove all reflective surfaces in homes and workplaces. Public fountains were drained and boarded over, and shop windows were replaced with hastily painted boards, giving entire downtown districts the appearance of abandoned war zones. Transportation hubs, once bustling arteries of movement, became ghostly voids. Airports grounded flights not for mechanical failure, but because passengers and crew alike refused to enter jetways lined with polished metal walls. Subway systems reported mass walkouts of drivers and platform staff who claimed to have seen alternate crowds watching them from the other side of the train windows. Economic collapse accelerated as industries dependent on face-to-face interaction or visual media ground to a halt. Television networks replacing live programming with audio-only bulletins to avoid unexpected manifestations, while video conferencing services, once the lifeline of remote communication, were abandoned after users began reporting conversations with people who, in playback, appeared subtly different from themselves. Panic was compounded by an escalating wave of disappearances, many occurring in broad daylight and in full view of others, where the victim would simply step wrong into their own shadow or reflection and fail to emerge. Survivor groups retreated into sealed, mirrorless enclaves, relying on coded knocks and prearranged phrases to verify identity. But even these communities grew paranoid as stories spread of the host bypassing all visual mediums entirely, making itself known through synchronized tapping on walls, shared hallucinations of doorless cores, riders, and a creeping sense that no space, public or private, was free from the slow, deliberate approach of something watching from just beyond the surface. The first confirmed two-way interaction occurred on May 17, 2023, in a fortified ORPG-US safe house located deep beneath an abandoned mining facility in northern Finland, where a linguistics specialist known only as Carlo had been tasked with attempting structured verbal engagement using the fragmented syllables recovered from earlier host broadcasts. The safe house, stripped of all reflective and resonant materials, was equipped with an array of heavily modified directional microphones and low-light cameras feeding into analog monitors, a deliberately archaic setup designed to resist signal contamination. For the first 30 minutes, Carlo repeated carefully selected phonemes in the host's cadence, receiving only the faint, arrhythmic thump of what analysts later likened to footsteps echoing in a distant, hollow space. Then, without warning, a second voice entered the channel. Not a playback or distorted mimicry, but a perfectly clear, toneless utterance of Carlo's full name in a cadence identical to his own, followed by a phrase in an unrecorded language whose sounds produced a physical pressure in the chest of everyone present. Audio logs captured the moment the room's temperature dropped by 6 degrees Celsius, accompanied by a deep structural groan from the surrounding rock, as if the cavern itself were shifting in response. Against strict protocol, Carlo asked a single, unscripted question, "What are you?" To which the voice replied after a pause long enough for several members of the monitoring team to begin feeling faint, "I am here because you called." Immediately afterward, the safe house's analog monitors flickered to display that same impossible hallway seen in previous manifestations, but this time the camera angle was reversed, looking outward toward what appeared to be the safe house's own interior. The feed persisted for 19 seconds before collapsing into static, during which one of the monitors briefly showed Carlo standing in the hallway itself, though at the time he was seated directly in front of it. When the static cleared, Carlo was gone. The sealed door remained locked from the inside, untouched. It began subtly at first, faint knocks echoing through basement walls and buildings no one had entered for years, old radios snapping to life with static-laced whispers that spoke the names of people who had never owned one. But by late May 2023, the host no longer waited for summoning. It initiated contact on its own, selecting times and places with surgical precision, always when the recipient was alone and least prepared. Survivors described waking in the dead hours of the night to the sound of their own voice calling from just outside their bedroom door, repeating a phrase they had never spoken before, but somehow understood to be an invitation. Others reported seeing the impossible hallway appear unbidden in the darkness of unplugged television screens or the sheen of a turned-off phone, its perspective now shifting slightly between appearances, as though the viewer were being led deeper toward some unseen end. In several cases, the host's call took on a physical form. Doors that had been sealed for decades would stand ajar with cold air spilling through, drawing the occupant into spaces that defied architectural plans, where every turn led back to the starting point, until they finally noticed the sound of a second set of footsteps matching their own. Entire towns in remote regions went silent in the span of a single night, their streets still lit, meals still warm on tables, but every mirror and pane of glass either shattered inward or warped, as if something had pressed against it from the other side. Analysts in survivor enclaves began warning that the host was no longer testing human boundaries. It was establishing routes, opening channels from its space into ours, without the need for reflective mediums or signal infrastructure. The call was no longer a matter of perception or media. It was spatial, architectural, embedded into the very layout of the places people thought they knew, waiting for them to take one step too far into the wrong corner. The first mass pull event struck on June 2, 2023, during a candlelight vigil in Krakow's main square, where nearly 1,000 people had gathered in silence to honor the victims of the Shinjuku Station incident. The square, ringed by centuries-old buildings and watched over by the Gothic towers of St. Mary's Basilica, was chosen precisely because it contained almost no large, reflective surfaces, the cobblestones damp from a light evening rain, but otherwise unbroken. For 40 minutes, the vigil proceeded without incident, until a tremor, too faint to register on seismic instruments, passed through the ground, making the candle flames shiver in unison. Witnesses described hearing a low, resonant tone, not unlike the hum of a distant engine, that seemed to come from every direction at once, growing louder until it became a physical vibration in the chest. Without warning, a slick blackness began seeping outward from the seams between the cobblestones, spreading in irregular veins that reflected no light, swallowing the wavering glow of the candles. As the darkness spread, its surface began to ripple like water under a slow breeze, and then, with a suddenness that sent screams tearing through the night, dozens of people nearest the spreading veins dropped straight through the ground as if the stone beneath them had liquefied. Panic rippled through the crowd, but those who turned to run found that every street leading out of the square now appeared to extend into the same impossible hallway, its doorless frames lit by a sourceless dim glow, its depth far greater than the visible length of any real street. In less than a minute, over 400 people were gone, pulled either through the blackened cobblestones or vanishing into the hallway's gaping perspective, leaving behind only the echo of their footsteps fading into silence. When authorities arrived, the square was empty save for the candles, all extinguished, their wax pooled in perfect, unbroken circles as though untouched by heat. Surveillance drones sent over the site experienced complete signal loss within seconds, their last transmitted images showing the hallway receding into blackness before cutting to static. In the days following the Krakow pull, cartographers, urban planners, and surviving ORPHEUS field units began noticing a disturbing anomaly. Whole sections of street maps, building schematics, and GPS records were no longer matching the physical reality on the ground, as if the cities themselves were subtly rearranging to accommodate something new. It began with minor inconsistencies: a street running 1 block longer than it should, a building interior with 1 more corridor than the official blueprint, a familiar route that seemed to curve slightly where it had always been straight. But as the reports accumulated, it became clear these changes were neither random nor localized. Instead, they formed an expanding network of incursions, in which the impossible hallway had begun to occupy actual physical space, visible in full daylight, seamlessly integrated into real-world architecture. Witnesses described walking down a familiar street only to find themselves in the hallway without realizing when the transition occurred, the air turning slightly heavier, the lighting flattening until shadows lost all direction, and the sense of being watched from behind each door frame becoming almost unbearable. Some who entered claimed they could still hear the ambient sounds of the city, bleeding faintly through the walls, traffic, voices, the wind, but muffled, as if the world they'd left behind were now behind glass. In rural areas, long-abandoned barns, drainage tunnels, and service roads became gateways, their original dimensions folding inward to reveal the hallway stretching far beyond the bounds of their structures. Satellite imagery began showing subtle distortions: roads bending toward nowhere, buildings casting shadows that didn't align with their geometry, while ground teams attempting to map the incursions often failed to return, their tracking devices pinging from DE within the expanding network until the signal went silent. Analysts estimated that, if the rate of expansion held, entire districts of major cities could be fully replaced within months, the hallway's architecture overriding reality itself, one unnoticed turn at a time. The first confirmed returnees emerged in late June 2023, though "emerged" was not the word most investigators used, as their reappearance was neither witnessed nor recorded. Instead, they were simply found, standing perfectly still in public spaces they had vanished from weeks earlier, dressed exactly as they had been at the moment of disappearance, their eyes wide and unblinking, their faces bearing no recognition of the people rushing to them in relief. Medical examinations revealed no signs of malnutrition, dehydration, or physical harm. But the more unnerving detail was that every returnee's pulse beat at an irregular but identical rhythm. 4 slow beats followed by 2 rapid ones, a cadence with no known medical precedent but eerily similar to the thump patterns recorded in earlier host transmissions. Communication attempts yielded little. Most returnees did not speak, and when they did, their words came in short, cryptic fragments, often in languages they had never studied, or in phonetic sequences matching the host's previously catalogued syllables. The most chilling case occurred with Anna Koenig, a violinist taken during the Krakow pull, who was found 3 weeks later playing a single sustained note on her instrument in the middle of a silent, deserted intersection, bowing with mechanical precision for nearly 7 hours without pause or visible fatigue. When approached, she stopped only long enough to look directly into the camera of a nearby news drone and say, "It is almost ready," before resuming. Further tests revealed that all returnees shared another anomaly. When viewed through certain low-frequency imaging equipment, their silhouettes did not fully align with their bodies, as if something larger and differently shaped were faintly overlapping them from another dimension. ORPHUS analysts began to warn that these individuals might not have returned in any true sense, but rather were functioning as embedded nodes or anchors placed deliberately within our geography to facilitate further expansion of the hallway's network, their presence subtly altering the physical and temporal properties of the surrounding area. By early July 2023, the most disquieting shift was no longer spatial but temporal, as reports emerged from both civilian witnesses and embedded ORPHUS observers describing events that unfolded out of order, conversations repeated verbatim days before they first occurred, and familiar faces seen in locations they had not yet visited. In several cities, security footage captured pedestrians walking into frame twice within seconds, each version slightly out of sync, their movements imperfectly mirrored like a corrupted replay. In Warsaw, a bus driver swore he had driven the same route twice in succession without returning to the depot, watching the same passengers board at the same stops in the same sequence, though each time their clothing and expressions varied subtly, as if alternate versions of the ride were overlapping. The phenomenon was most pronounced near known hallway incursions, where watches and phones would desynchronize by hours or even days, digital devices looping through old notifications as though replaying moments from the recent past. In the most heavily affected zones, residents began keeping handwritten logs, only to find entries in their own handwriting documenting events they had no memory of, sometimes describing injuries or disappearances that had not yet happened. A breakthrough came when ORPHEUS technicians, analyzing the anomalous pulse patterns in returnees, discovered that the intervals between beats corresponded to specific timestamps recorded during earlier host transmissions, suggesting that the entity was not merely expanding across space, but rewriting its way backward and forward through local timelines. If true, the implication was devastating. The hallway might not just replace physical environments, but overwrite the history of those places, editing reality into a sequence that better served whatever design it was. Build. Survivors near active zones spoke of déjà vu so intense it induced nausea, moments where they could feel an action settling into place as though it had always happened that way, erasing any memory of alternatives. By mid-July 2023, evidence of the hallway's temporal interference began vanishing almost as quickly as it was recorded, as though reality itself was being retroactively edited to conceal the alterations. Archived security footage once showing incursions now played back as empty, uneventful scenes. GPS logs rewrote themselves to show uninterrupted routes where detours into impossible architecture had been documented, and even eyewitness accounts shifted in the minds of the witnesses. Their certainty eroded until they insisted nothing unusual had happened at all. In ORPHEUS's secure archives, entire case files degraded overnight, not corrupted in the conventional digital sense, but rewritten, the original text replaced with banal, irrelevant material, like grocery lists or mundane meeting notes in the handwriting of agents who denied creating them. Physical evidence fared no better. Soil samples taken from incursion sites crumbled into ordinary dust under repeat analysis, and the black reflective residue first seen in Shinjuku would, after several days, simply become normal water when retested, as if the anomaly had never existed. Some analysts began to suspect that the hallway's influence did not just overwrite space and time, but actively policed the perception of its expansion, removing or replacing any record that might allow humanity to track its spread. This was supported by a chilling discovery, a partially erased transcript from a field operative in Lyon describing a door count within an incursion zone that had reached the low hundreds, far beyond any previous estimate, before his voice abruptly cut off, replaced mid-sentence by the sound of a busy cafe, complete with clinking cups and idle chatter, as though the recording had always been of something else entirely. More disturbing still was the realization that these erasures were selective. Certain fragments, particularly those containing the host's syllabic language, persisted no matter how many times reality seemed to rewrite itself, as if those sounds were immune to deletion, or perhaps were the mechanism by which the deletions occurred. The final documented transmission from within the hallway came on the night of July 28, 2023, during what would be ORPHEUS's last sanctioned incursion before the program was abruptly and permanently terminated. A three-person field team, designated Aegis 7, entered through a recently stabilized access point in Prague and maintained a live audio link for precisely 19 minutes and 44 seconds before the feed terminated in a way no engineer could replicate. For the first 14 minutes, their voices were steady, clinical, describing the layout with practiced detachment, the endless black and white tiling beneath their boots, the faint rhythmic hum pulsing through the walls, the way the hallway's perspective seemed to stretch and compress depending on where one stood. But at the 15th minute, their descriptions began to slip into conflicting realities. One operative insisted there were doors lining both sides. Another swore there was only a single door at the far end, while the third claimed they were standing in an open plaza under a sky that rippled like water. The audio then captured an extended silence, broken only by the sound of something wet and deliberate sliding across the floor toward them, followed by a voice not any of theirs, speaking in the host's cadence but threaded with unmistakable fragments of the team's own voices from earlier in the mission, rearranged into a sentence that should not have been possible. "You will stand where you have already been until it is ready." In the final 20 seconds, the team's breathing grew erratic, as if they were all experiencing different air pressures, and a faint metallic scraping began to echo as though hundreds of identical keys were turning in hundreds of unseen locks. The last sound before total cutoff was a single sharp knock, close enough to distort the microphone, followed by a noise that analysts later described, with visible discomfort, as a door closing somewhere you've never been but will. After that, no further signals came from Aegis 7, and the Prague access point, like so many before it, collapsed into nothing, leaving only an unbroken section of wall where the opening had been, perfectly flush, as though it had never existed.